January 11th, 2013, Kendrick Johnson was supposed to come home after school, like always, but that night his bedroom light stayed off. His phone went unanswered, and when his mother, Jackie, stood by the front door looking out into the dark, something didn't feel right. A silence had entered the house, one too deep to ignore. By morning, panic had taken over. Calls were made. The school was contacted. Kendrick's name was announced over the intercom asking him to report to class, but he didn't, because by then, Kendrick's body was already inside the school. It was around 10:30 a.m. when a group of students at Lowndes High School stepped into the old gym, the one barely used anymore. There, at the corner of the wall, stood several giant wrestling mats rolled up vertically. One of them had a pair of white socks sticking out from the center. A student climbed up and peered inside the mat's hollow core, then stumbled back. What he'd seen wasn't just socks. It was a body, stuffed upside down inside the rolled-up mat, cramped, folded, lifeless. Within minutes, school administrators locked the area down. Law enforcement was called, and as paramedics arrived, one of them shined a flashlight down into the mat's interior. The boy's head was facing downward, his arms trapped above him, as if he tried to reach for something, but never made it back. He was unrecognizable at first. Blood had pooled around his face. His skin was swollen, darkened from the pressure. His sneakers were off, lying beside him at the bottom of the mat. But inside his pockets, they found a laminated school ID. It was Kendrick Johnson. He was 17 years old, a quiet, kind-hearted student. Popular, athletic, known for his discipline. He played football and basketball, and he'd often spend time in the gym, sometimes even storing his extra shoes there so he wouldn't have to rent a locker. At first, authorities treated it like a tragic accident. They believed Kendrick had dropped a shoe inside one of the mats and tried to retrieve it by climbing in head first. He got stuck, couldn't breathe, died there overnight while the school carried on around him. But that explanation didn't sit right with anyone who knew him. Kendrick was nearly 6 feet tall. The mat's opening was just over 14 inches wide, and the position he was found in, completely vertical with his body upside down and arms pinned, didn't look like a fall. It looked deliberate. His parents, Jackie and Kenneth Johnson, were called to identify the body. They stood in the gym staring at the mat, but they weren't shown their son. Not then. Not fully, not until the funeral home, and when they saw him there, face battered, lips bloated, eyes sealed shut from pressure, they said this wasn't a tragic accident. It was something else, something darker, something done. News spread quickly through Valdosta. A boy found dead in a school mat? No witnesses? No one heard anything? In a building filled with teachers, coaches, students? Whispers turned to questions. Questions turned to outrage, and when Kendrick's body was sent for autopsy and the cause of death came back as accidental positional asphyxia, the Johnson family rejected it outright because they believed deeply that someone had killed their son, and they were ready to prove it. Jackie Johnson didn't believe it, not for a second. Her son, Kendrick, was strong, athletic, calm under pressure. He wasn't reckless. He didn't go climbing into tight spaces for fun. And even if he had, he would have called for help. He would have fought his way out. She believed something happened to him. Someone happened to him. But the authorities didn't see it that way. The very next day, the Lowndes County Sheriff's Office issued a statement. They believed Kendrick's death was accidental. They claimed he'd dropped a shoe into the center of the rolled mat, one he often stored there to avoid locker fees, and had tried to retrieve it by diving in head first. He got stuck, couldn't breathe, and over the hours suffocated upside down. That was it. No foul play suspected. But Kendrick's parents weren't satisfied with that version of events. They knew something was wrong, not just in what they were being told, but in how it was all being handled. For starters, they weren't even allowed to see their son's full autopsy photos, and the ones they were given showed injuries far too severe to be explained by suffocation alone. Kendrick's face was bloated, discolored. There were deep bruises on his neck and jaw. His fingernails were broken, as if he'd been clawing for something, and his internal organs were gone. That discovery came weeks later when the Johnsons ordered a second independent autopsy. When the body was exhumed, the pathologist found the organs had been removed, and in their place was crumpled newspaper. The funeral home claimed the organs had been destroyed through natural decomposition, but the Johnsons didn't buy that either. Newspaper in a sealed body? Who does that? And if that wasn't strange enough, there was the surveillance footage. Lowndes High School had over 30 security cameras operating in and around the gym. But when Kendrick's family requested to see they found something disturbing. Several hours of footage were missing. From the exact window of time Kendrick was last seen, around 1:30 p.m. on January 10th, to the early morning of January 11th, the footage cut in and out. Some cameras had blank spots, others jumped forward by hours, and some were simply labeled not working. No one could explain why. In one clip, Kendrick is seen walking into the gym wearing black and white athletic shoes and carrying a yellow folder. But there's no footage of him ever leaving. No interaction with other students. No sign of distress. He walks in and vanishes. His yellow folder was never found. The official story still insisted it was an accident, but now the Johnsons were convinced someone had done this, and someone was covering it up. They went public. They held press conferences. They walked the halls of Lowndes High School with reporters, showing where Kendrick was found, where the mat stood, where the cameras should have been recording. People started listening. Activists joined the cause. Celebrities spoke out, and the hashtag Justice for Kendrick began trending across the country. The family accused local law enforcement of ignoring evidence, of protecting someone, and when they asked the FBI to intervene, they were told there wasn't enough proof of foul play to open a federal case. But the Johnsons didn't stop. They marched. They sued. They demanded answers. And eventually, in 2014, they filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the Lowndes County Board of Education, claiming Kendrick had been murdered by fellow students, and the school had helped cover it up. By now, names were being whispered, suspects, motives. A theory began to take shape, one the Johnsons believed with all their heart. But the people accused? They had powerful families and secrets of their own. The Johnsons believed they knew who did it. They named two brothers, both students at Lowndes High School, both athletes, both sons of an FBI agent. Their theory was simple, but devastating. Kendrick had been in an altercation with one of the boys months earlier. A fight on the school bus, they said. Over a girl, maybe. There had been tension since then, and according to Jackie and Kenneth Johnson, Kendrick had been receiving threats. Subtle, dismissed by school officials, but real. The family's lawsuit claimed Kendrick had been attacked in the gym, beaten, and then placed inside the rolled-up mat to make it look like an accident. They believed the crime scene had been manipulated, the body staged, and that afterward, someone with influence had worked to erase the trail. Missing footage, missing organs, a missing folder, and a missing truth. The brothers denied everything. Their father, the FBI agent, called the accusations malicious and irresponsible. He said his sons had been unfairly targeted, victims of grief and rumor, but the Johnsons kept pushing. They pointed to a tweet one of the boys allegedly sent after Kendrick's death. It said, simply, "You reap what you sow." That tweet was deleted, but screenshots circulated. Investigators looked into it. They searched lockers, questioned students, examined alibis, but nothing stuck. No charges were filed. The local sheriff stood by his original ruling, accidental death by positional asphyxia. To the family, that sounded like code for, "We're not going to look any deeper." Meanwhile, an anonymous email arrived at the sheriff's office. The writer claimed a female student had overheard a confession at a party, that Kendrick had been struck with a dumbbell during a fight in the gym, and that school officials helped cover it up. The tip was chilling, specific. But when questioned, the girl denied everything. No confession, no pay, no witness. The tip went nowhere. And so time kept passing. Clues grew colder, witnesses stopped talking, and the narrative, accident or murder, depended entirely on who you believed. But behind the scenes, pressure was mounting. National media picked up the story. CNN ran a segment questioning the sheriff's report. Civil rights activists began rallying in Valdosta. Protesters gathered outside the school. Kendrick's photo appeared on posters, banners, t-shirts. His mother marched with his portrait in her hands, tears in her eyes, chanting, "My son was murdered." In October 2013, the Department of Justice finally opened a federal review of the case. It gave the Johnsons hope. Maybe now the truth would come out. Maybe now someone outside Georgia, outside Lowndes County, would look at the evidence with fresh eyes. But that review would take time, years in fact. And the longer it dragged on, the more divided the public became. Some believed the Johnsons were chasing ghosts, unable to accept a tragic accident. Others believed the truth was being buried under influence and power. But one thing was certain. Kendrick's body told a different story than the one in the police report. In the second autopsy, the private pathologist concluded Kendrick had died from blunt force trauma to the neck. The first autopsy had said positional asphyxia. The second said blunt force trauma. Two very different causes, two very different stories, but only one truth. By now, the Johnsons were drained, emotionally, financially. Their lawsuits had been dismissed. They'd spent over $1 million searching for answers, and still, no one had been arrested, no one had been charged, no one had confessed. But Jackie Johnson wasn't letting go. She stood outside the courthouse holding up a photo of her son in his basketball jersey. "I know what happened to my child," she said, "and I won't stop. Until the world knows too." By 2015, 2 years had passed. Kendrick Johnson's case was no longer front-page news, but for his parents, time hadn't dulled anything. If anything, the silence made the pain sharper. They had buried their only son, exhumed him, held press conferences, filed lawsuits, and waited. But justice hadn't come. In June of that year, the Department of Justice quietly announced it was closing its investigation. No criminal charges would be filed. The evidence, they said, was insufficient to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that someone or some group of people violated Kendrick Johnson's civil rights. It was a crushing blow. To the Johnsons, this wasn't just a legal decision. It was a death sentence for the truth. The system had spoken, and it had said, "We're done looking." But the Johnsons refused to let the final word be silence. They held another rally, another march, another interview, and this time the world started watching again. By now, the story of Kendrick Johnson had become something more, a symbol. His face was held up at protests across the country. His name was shouted alongside others lost to suspicious deaths. Tamla Horsford, Sandra Bland, and others. Stories where answers were murky, where families said the official narratives didn't make sense. People began to connect the dots. They saw patterns, and they demanded accountability. For Kendrick's parents, every rally was personal. Jackie Johnson walked with a t-shirt that read, "Who killed KJ?" She carried her grief like armor, refusing to let the memory fade. They tried again. In 2018, they filed a civil lawsuit against 38 individuals, including local law enforcement, school officials, and the sons of the FBI agent. The suit alleged a wide-ranging conspiracy to cover up a murder. It was explosive, bold, and risky. But in the end, the suit was dismissed again, citing lack of evidence. The Johnsons appealed, and appealed again. In 2021, Kendrick's body was exhumed for the 3rd time. Another independent autopsy was conducted, and again, it concluded that the teen had likely died from blunt force trauma. Once again, the findings clashed with the official story. Once again, no charges followed, but something had changed. That year, the Lowndes County Sheriff's Office announced they were reopening the investigation, this time reviewing over 17 boxes of evidence gathered during the federal probe. They said they were starting from scratch. The Johnsons were hopeful, but cautious. They had been here before. Promises, reviews, then silence. Still, they welcomed the reopening, because for them, Kendrick's case had never gone cold. Not in their hearts, not in their home. In the hallway of their house, Kendrick's room remained untouched. His basketball trophies lined the shelves. His shoes sat neatly by the door. His bed was still made. His backpack still full. He was frozen in time. 17 years old forever, and Jackie still called his phone sometimes, just to hear the voicemail, just to feel close. The reopened case brought new eyes, but the same old questions. Why was there missing footage? Why were Kendrick's organs replaced with newspaper? Why were some witnesses never re-interviewed? Why had no one ever been held responsible? Even now, answers remained elusive. The sheriff's department eventually announced their conclusion: no criminal charges. They called the case tragic, but not criminal. The Johnsons called it what they always had, a cover-up. But they weren't just fighting for Kendrick anymore. They were fighting for every family who had been told to move on. Every parent whose child's death was filed away as accidental, with no closure. And that's when something unexpected happened. In 2022, a filmmaker approached them. He wanted to tell Kendrick's story, all of it. The family agreed, not for attention, but for memory, for truth. The documentary was released. It sparked debate, outrage, sympathy, and for many viewers, it was the first time they saw Kendrick Johnson's story for what it really was, a chilling mystery still unresolved. There are stories that end, and then there are stories that echo. Kendrick Johnson's story never really ended. It just became quieter and heavier, a shadow that followed his parents into every courtroom, every protest, every sleepless night. More than a decade has passed since that January day when a teenager walked into a high school gym and never walked out. But the timeline never settled. There was no confession, no charges, no final word that made the pain make sense. Instead, there were theories, rumors, tips that vanished, tapes that cut off, and a family that refused to let the world move on. Jackie and Kenneth Johnson never got the justice they imagined. Not in the form of arrests, not in the form of courtroom answers, but they got something else. They forced the nation to look at what happens when Black children die under mysterious circumstances. And the system shrugs. To look at how grief turns into suspicion, how suspicion turns into protest, and how protest, when loud enough, can pierce even the most silent walls. Because Kendrick didn't die in a dark alley or a forgotten town. He died in a school hallway, a place where children are supposed to be safe, where cameras are supposed to work, where adults are supposed to care. But somehow, between the rolled-up mats and missing footage, the truth was lost, or hidden. The case became a lightning rod, not because it was simple, but because it wasn't, because it asked uncomfortable questions, because it made people choose between believing in coincidence or in conspiracy, and because it forced America to reckon with an old, familiar ache. What does justice look like when the system says, case closed, and a mother says, not yet? Kendrick's story isn't a solved mystery. It's an open wound, and it sits beside so many others. Emmett Till, Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin. Different names, different cities, but always the same ache. A young life gone, and no one held responsible. For the Johnsons, the fight is no longer about reopening the case. It's about remembrance, visibility, keeping Kendrick's name from being erased. His portrait now hangs on posters carried by protesters. His face is printed on T-shirts worn at rallies. His name is written on the pavement in chalk, washed away by rain, redrawn again the next day. And at home in Valdosta, Georgia. The house is quiet. Jackie still keeps Kendrick's room just the way he left it. The bed is made, the shoes are in place. The basketball sits in the corner, dust collecting on its surface. Every morning she walks past his door. Every night she says goodnight like she used to. And every day she waits. Not just for justice, but for peace. In one interview, when asked what she wants the world to remember about her son, Jackie didn't talk about lawsuits, or autopsies, or evidence. She said, "He was kind, he was goofy, he had the biggest heart, and he should still be here." That's the truth she clings to. That's the truth no report can erase. And for those who followed Kendrick's story, for those who've read every theory, watched every documentary, and still don't have an answer, there's one thing left to say. Look again. Look closer, because sometimes the truth isn't in the evidence. It's in the persistence of those who won't let the silence win.